The ocean around the remote island was angry that evening, its white-capped waves bullying Captain Axel's supply schooner as it struggled toward the lonely lighthouse that stabbed at the sky. The previous weather officer posted there hadn't radioed in for months, so the captain had brought a replacement, a quiet meteorologist named David, and enough crates of food and fuel to last a full year. As the anchor splashed down, the two men scanned the craggy shoreline. Only one tiny signal fire glowed, some distance from the lighthouse itself. "Strange," the captain muttered. "The station ought to be fully lit if the keeper were alive." Sensing trouble, he and David rowed ashore without wasting a second. Moonlight revealed something bizarre. The lighthouse was ringed by a brutal fence of sharpened wooden stakes, jammed into the ground like a wall of teeth. It looked less like a beacon and more like a fortress, as if someone meant to lock the world out, or something in. They hammered on the iron gate again and again. No answer. Finally, the captain threw his weight against it. The hinges screamed, and both men spilled inside. Up on the lantern deck, they found a gaunt, gray-bearded man reclining on a cot, puffing an old pipe. He introduced himself with a grunt, "Gruner." When asked about the former weather officer, Gruner shrugged as though discussing the weather. "He died," he said. "Some terrible illness." "And the body?" the captain pressed. "Probably got himself killed," Gruner answered, eyes flat. The reply sent a chill through David. The man's mind seemed unhinged, but until they learned the truth, there was nothing to be done. The captain offered David one last chance to sail back, but the young scientist shook his head. If he could send accurate government weather reports from here, the bonus money would change his life. He stayed. Before leaving, the captain pressed a revolver into David's hand. "For protection," he warned. "This rock isn't as safe as it looks." Then the schooner's sail dwindled into the dark, leaving David alone with the lighthouse keeper and the howling sea. David spent that first day turning a rickety cottage nearby into living quarters. In a drawer, he discovered a weather-stained diary, the previous officer's. The opening entry was dated 1913. Much of the handwriting had faded, and many sentences trailed off in mid-thought. Between the pages were strange pencil sketches of lizard-eyed creatures, half human, half fish, crawling out of surf. At the back was a small photograph of a smiling woman, perhaps the diarist's wife. Reading line after line, David's eyelids eventually drooped, and he nodded off at the desk. Next morning, he trekked to the shoreline to launch his first weather balloons. Between two rocks, he spotted a strange arrangement of stones and seashells, a spiral pattern too deliberate to be random. Probably Gruner's handiwork, David decided, and returned to his instruments. When he raised his binoculars later, he caught a fleeting glimpse of another figure beside Gruner atop the lantern room. But when he looked again, only the keeper remained. "Must be my imagination," he told himself. Night fell while David was charting barometric readings. Knock, knock, knock. He assumed it was Gruner and called his name. No reply. Lantern in hand, he edged toward the door and froze. From beneath the gap, a rubbery, web-fingered claw slipped inside, groping blindly for the latch. Terror slammed through him. He bolted down to the cellar and barricaded himself. Floorboards creaked overhead. Something shuffled through the cottage, sniffing, searching. Through a hairline crack in the plank wall, a luminous reptilian eye peered straight at him. David snatched a carving knife and, when the eye returned, stabbed with all his strength. A shrill screech, then silence. The intruder scuttled off into the night, but would surely return. At dawn, David found footprints leading from his door to the tide line, long, splayed, and clawed. No human had made those tracks. Now he understood why sharpened stakes encircled the lighthouse. A monster stalked this island, and the cottage was no refuge. Panicked, David raced to the tower and begged Gruner to open up. The keeper only spat, "You should have sailed away with your captain." He slammed the hatch. Rejected, David fortified his cottage, nailed planks across every window, ringed the walls with more stakes, and piled greasy papers outside to burn as a firewall. While scavenging for supplies, he found an old lockbox containing an extra rifle and a heap of bullets. Courage flickered, but fear still ruled as shadows lengthened. Darkness. A rasping chorus rose from the sea. David's candle trembled. He peered through a slit. Dozens of slick bodies were wading ashore, eyes glinting like wet emeralds. The horde surrounded the cottage and battered the front gate. He opened fire. Some creatures collapsed, but the rest only shrieked louder. When the barricade buckled, David hurled a lantern onto the oil-soaked papers. Flames roared up, driving the attackers back, but the blaze leapt to the wooden walls. The house became an inferno. Wrapped in a wet blanket, David smashed through the rear door and sprinted for the lighthouse, hiding behind a boulder. His right arm was seared raw. Rain came mercifully and quenched the blaze, yet by dawn nothing remained of the cottage but charcoal. With nowhere else to go, David ambushed Gruner at the water barrel, rifle raised. But before he could speak, one of the creatures, a slim, smaller female, emerged at Gruner's side like a guard dog. Gruner hissed, "She's my pet. Lower your weapon." David offered a deal, shelter him, and he would share his gunpowder and provisions. Gruner paused, then grudgingly agreed. That night, David woke to something licking the blistered skin of his burned arm. It was the female creature. Warm saliva coated the wound, and incredibly the flesh began to knit together. David gaped. The being was no mindless beast. It could heal. At sunrise, he saw Gruner counting ammunition, while the creature, nimble and obedient, stacked crates for him. Clearly she was intelligent, perhaps even gentle. David's scientific curiosity flared. If he could study this species and reveal it to the world, fame and fortune awaited. Gruner wanted no part of that. The island, he said, was his kingdom. Society forced everyone to serve someone. Here he answered to nobody. David learned the creature had once tangled in Gruner's fishing net as a juvenile. Gruner freed her, then kept her as property, using her for labor, and worse. Each night her kin came ashore, trying to rescue her, and each night Gruner's rifle drove them back. Repulsed, David resolved to contact a passing ship. Gruner laughed. No vessel stopped here. But David watched the horizon anyway. Night after night, the sea folk swarmed. Sometimes Gruner forced David outside alone, bolting the door to teach him courage. By dawn, David would stagger in, bloodied but alive, rage and fear slowly hardening into grim skill. In daytime, he hauled water, polished lenses, did every chore Gruner demanded. A reluctant bond grew between the men, forged in relentless danger, yet David's sympathy for the female, whom he secretly named Aneris, deepened. As winter edged close, the attacks suddenly lessened. David hoped the creatures migrated like whales. Gruner insisted they were only breeding, multiplying for a final assault. One wind-lashed night, the two men killed time over a game of chess and forgot to light the beacon. The darkened tower was a silent invitation. When screams echoed outside, hundreds of creatures were already scaling the walls. Bullets ran low. The pair retreated to the lantern room where a misstep gashed Gruner's leg badly. Dawn's first rays at last forced the attackers back to sea. Supplies dwindled. The wound festered. Aneris tended Gruner, licking the infection clean, and the old man's fever broke. But David saw hopelessness in his eyes. The next afternoon, a cargo steamer appeared on the horizon. David scrambled for the flare gun, but Gruner shoved him aside. He would not lose his kingdom or his servant. Aneris, seeing the fight, slammed Gruner, shielding David. By the time the struggle ended, the ship had slipped beyond the headland and disappeared. Weeks crawled by. Aneris led David to a hidden cove where a half-sunken smuggler's boat lay, cargo holds rumored to still contain dynamite. Gruner at first refused to help. until he realized explosive crates could wipe out the enemy forever. Clad in a corroded diving suit, David descended to the wreck. Inside, skeletal corpses floated among crates of munitions. Two juvenile sea creatures watched him curiously, but didn't attack. He surfaced with several boxes of dynamite. Together, the men wired 2 rings of charges around the lighthouse foundation. Snow began falling. The sea remained eerily calm. Perhaps Aneris had warned her people, Gruner snarled. In rage, he beat her. David intervened, and the 2 humans finally agreed on one last trap. Leave the main gate open, lure the creatures inside, then detonate. Night of reckoning. The tide disgorged an army that surged straight into the lighthouse courtyard. David fought at the threshold. When the outer ring was packed with bodies, he shouted the signal. Gruner yanked the plunger. Nothing. In panic, David dashed upstairs, found a loose wire, and reconnected it. The first layer roared. Fire, stone, and scales hurled skyward. Screeching survivors scrambled over debris. Gruner triggered the second blast. Thunder ripped the tower. Both men were flung unconscious. Morning light revealed a wasteland of shattered corpses. Aneris was gone. Among the dead, David noticed a carved necklace, proof the creatures had art, memory, civilization. Realization stabbed him. They had been killing sentient beings who only wanted their family back. Days later, David spotted orphaned sea children near the shore. He built a small stone circle and placed a whalebone toy boat inside, a peace offering for Aneris. But she never came. Gruner, hobbling on a cane, grew volatile. Loneliness, the memory of a dead wife, and years of isolation had eroded his sanity. One dusk, seeing the sea folk gathering peacefully by the water, David begged him to stop the violence. Gruner loaded his signal flare and, in front of them all, shot a hatchling. The tribe fled wailing, and Aneris's eyes filled with betrayal. Enraged, David grappled the old man. Axe raised, Gruner would have killed him, until David cried the name Robert, the name he'd read in the faded photograph. The sound pierced Gruner's madness. He staggered outside and, in a moment of broken clarity, surrendered to the sea creatures. They encircled him, then silenced him forever. David bolted himself inside the tower and waited. Seasons rolled past. A year later, a government cutter arrived carrying a fresh weather officer and a bureaucrat. They found a bearded man in lighthouse overalls and assumed he was the renowned keeper Gruner. David did not correct them. He simply stepped onto the balcony and gazed at the glittering waves, unwilling to leave the island that had changed him. Down on the beach, Aneris appeared with her children. No longer hunted, they basked in the surf, free at last from any tyrant's rule. David lifted a hand in quiet salute as the lighthouse lamp began its slow, steady sweep across the darkening sea. A beacon of warning, perhaps, but also of hard-won peace.